Добрый день. Спасибо всем, кто нашел время
Good
присоединиться.
afternoon, everyone. Good evening, rather. I wish to thank everyone who has found time to join us here for the first discussion, which is dedicated to the restoration of cities destroyed because of the hostilities, because of warfare, because of war. I am an employee of the Center for Independent Social Research in Berlin. We are running this series of discussion within the framework of projects supported by the German Foreign Ministry. With you today will be two wonderful speakers, Marina Semenchenko. She's Master of Sciences in Urban Planning, background Royal Stockholm University. She's a teacher of the college in Belarus. So Marina will be talking about restoration of Minsk, one of the most devastated cities during the Second World War. Her presentation will be entitled The Faceless City, Spatial Identity of Minsk after the World War II. City without a face. We also have Dmitry Bayko here with us. He's an urban planner, Geoclator company general manager in Volgograd. Now he's a guest speaker in Hanover, Germany. He will be speaking about yet another famous city, which became even more famous after the Second World War. This is the former Staliningrad, currently known as Volgograd. His presentation will be entitled Post-War Restoration of Stalingrad, monumental nature of that restoration. Once again, gratitude to those who have joined us, who found the time to join us. I will talk about the upcoming discussions that are in store for you in the near future, who's going to participate in them. I also wish to say a few words about the technical bits. Now, down below the screen, you have this magic button, simultaneous interpretation into English. So whoever will have an easier time following this in English, they will be able to do so because of this great interpreter from Belarus that is working here for us today. His name is Yuri. Now, after the presentation, after Marina's and Dmitri's presentation, your questions will be welcome in the chat box, or alternatively, you can unmute your mic, provide comments, ask questions. Right. So I believe we can get this started. I have just have a request. While you're listening, please make sure your microphones are muted. When Maria and Dmitry are done talking and you have a question, you can just simply flip the switch of your mic on, unmute it, and ask a question. Marina has the floor first. Thank you, Sergey. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. We have different time zones as far as I'm aware, so it might be good afternoon for some of us. So let me share my screen now, and let me proceed with whatever I wished to tell you today. So my presentation is quite saturated. I hope my pace of speech is okay for the interpreter. I have a lot to tell, so if I'm going too fast, well, I'll appreciate some heads up about that. I'll be talking about Minsk today. The presentation has this provocative title, A Faceless City, or City Without a Face, because I wanted to delve into the question myself. How come Minsk turned out to be the way it is? According to the opinions of many researchers, visitors, Minsk has become a city, a place without manifested, well-pronounced individuality. I hope that we'll get closer to the answer to that dilemma, to that question. Let me first show you a satellite map of Minsk. It's a fairly recent one. This is the current appearance of the city. The yellow dotted line is the Beltway, and the main avenue is the blue dots in the middle. This is Minsk of 1942, during the occupation time. The same scale of the map, so you see how much smaller Minsk used to be 70 years ago in 1942. Again, the blue line signifies the main avenue, the high street. And this is Minsk in 1943. The blue one is the Zakharivska Street, which came to be known as the avenue, and the Minsk is even smaller. Now, when we get to the topic of the post-war restoration of Minsk, if we start dealing with the topic, we encounter a few myths, which are only part true. And today I wanted not really to debunk those myths, not to bust them, but to mention and identify the truth and myth in each of them. The first myth is that Minsk was devastated almost completely during the Second World War, and the appearance of today's Minsk has been shaped by the destructions of the war. This is definitely part true. However, it's important to understand that the intention to restore Minsk authentically has never been the issue after the war. There was none. Although quite a lot of foundations and quite a lot of frameworks of old buildings have survived that could have been restored if there was the wish to do so. But there was no wish to do so. There was no willingness to do that. I will just try to identify a few events before and during the Second World War and after the Second World War that shaped the face of Minsk. The second myth is that the post-war restoration was happening quite quickly and with a lot of enthusiasm by the local city dwellers, by Minskers. And this is a problematic point from many perspectives. Well, first of all, unfortunately, the restoration was not progressing as fast as we would have wanted it to. A shortage of resources, manpower, funds, organizational resources, all of that was in acute shortage. As for city dwellers, it was quite little known who those people were, because quite a number of Minskers died during the war. The biggest part of Jewish population was exterminated, not just in Minsk, but across Belarus. In 1940s, in the 1930s, the cultural elite during the repressions, they were exterminated, and those people were the foundation of the city's life. So it was little known of who Minskers were, indeed, after the Second World War. So this is the central Minsk in 1952. This is the main avenue that I will get to mention many times today. This is the intersection with the Kozlova Street. So this is the downtown, as downtown as it gets. And it looked like that 6-7 years after the liberation. Now this picture dates back to 1944. This is the participation and engagement of citizens, of Minskers, particularly women, in the restoration effort. Many researchers, particularly Thomas Bonn, a German researcher, he said that researchers say that they were not as enthusiastic in restoring the city as the Soviet narrative would have us believe. So yes, the Sunday works were done. So each one, they were dedicated to dismantling the debris. Fewer and fewer people turned in for every next Sunday work, Воскресник. So this process was going much slower and much harder than we might imagine. Again, so what is interesting about Minsk? There was a huge and unprecedented growth of population. I highlighted this 30 years, 1950 through 1980. I've highlighted them in different color in the table on the left. We see 273,000, 250,000 in 1950 and 1.3 million 30 years on. In some of these decades, the growth was about 100%. Was nearing 100%. Right-hand side is the provision of social and welfare services for the population in the 1960s and 70s, late 1960s. Definitely the first post-war years were about construction new residential areas, residential spaces, even those basic services such as high schools, kindergartens, hospitals, polyclinics, they were in acute shortage. So just bear this in mind whenever we talk about Minsk, its spatial structure, particularly about its post-war restoration. So I have broken down my presentation into several chapters. So it's mostly for my sake, but I also hope that this chaptering will help you follow my train of thought. But this is not some historic periodization. Minsk is an internally incomplete project. This has been the case for several centuries at least. The first event I wish to recall with respect to the spatial organization of Minsk is the second partition of Rzeczpospolita, which is when Minsk and this part of Belarus started becoming part of Russian Empire. And the first generalistic plan of Minsk in 1817 started to be developed. So this is what it looks like, nothing peculiar, nothing special, regular network of streets, rectangular blocks, squares that also orthogonal, symmetrical, so quite predictable for classicism, for the classicism epoch. Now, what's important, it is during this time that the new downtown starts taking shape. Now, this red line on the map shows the network of those classicist streets that took shape back then. And these dots here outline the old, historic, authentic center, downtown, in the vicinity of Nemiga River. It's medieval, it's chaotic, quite non-systematic. It just came to be this way throughout centuries. Also, since mid-19th century, another part of downtown starts developing because all kinds of capitalistic processes start to kick into gear. Railway becomes of higher importance, which is when the downtown part adjacent to the railway station starts developing. It becomes a big commercial and transport hub, and it gets to become the first Soviet downtown. And this topic of multiple downtowns and conflicting among themselves, it will be voiced, it will be referred to many times today. And again, this triangle of railway networks also contributes to this shape of block. So what is typical for this era? First of all, the spatial identity is very closely linked to the ideology. This appears a generic term, a generic statement. This is true for other timelines, time frames, for other places. But with respect to Minsk, it's very important. The regimes, ideologies come and go. And sometimes they even fail to implement their own spatial ideology. And so the new ideology comes in before the previous one has been able to influence the spatial organization its own way. It's also important that the eras come and go, the new ones replace the old ones, and the previous eras, previous epochs are only preserved as standalone buildings or ensembles. So just a bunch of streets, for example. The same happened to Baroque epoch. After Poland, well, it started to be considered as hostile, as something alien, something related to the past life, but not the current one. So the Baroque had to go. Minsk is an ideal social city. So this is my second chapter. Ideal is in make-believe, utopia, a place that cannot be built, cannot exist. So what is a socialist city? The architects, the urban planners didn't really understand what that was supposed to mean. This project was also incomplete. Just a small spoiler here. Now, talking about the spatial structure that develops in this era, I decided to refer to Arthur Klino's book, Minsk, architect and writer, who digested this idea in a very special way. He based it on the Thomas More idea, utopia, utopic city, and he applied it to the socialist Minsk. We see this avenue here once again. This is a zoomed in version. During this time, during the Soviet time, this avenue becomes quite prominent. 6 important hubs take shape during this era. The first one is a bit off the main axis, but it's also very important in this ideology. The city of sun. Basically, this is what Arthur Klino's book is entitled, and there are several places which are symbolic. The first square is the railway station square, or the gate to the city. This is what it looked like after the war, and this is in the 70s. This portal is kind of an entrance gateway to this wonderful city of the sun, where wonderful Soviet people live. Minsk is on the diagonal between Berlin and Moscow. Minsk is kind of an incoming gateway to the Soviet Union, to the wonderful country of universal happiness. The second place is the Square of Independence. This is currently known as the Square of Wisdom, as it used as it's called by Arthur Klino. It looks the same, only there was a Lenin statue on the pedestal. It's not there. It wasn't there in the occupation time, obviously. The place of wisdom, because it houses the main governmental buildings, plus the university, Belarusian State University. The metaphysics square, or the central square, the October Square as it's referred to today, it's the most problematic from the urban planning viewpoint. It is the embodiment of the idea of internal incompletion or incompleteness, because a whole lot of architectural contests were implemented. Not one of them was done. Not one of them was manifested in something real. That monument to Stalin that you see in the background was erected several months, maybe 6 months before Stalin died. So again, all ideas, all ideologies are unable to reflect themselves in space. Spatial implementation is lagging behind severely, in the best case. This is what it looks in the early 21st century, the Palace of the Republic on the left. According to the researchers' opinion, this Palace of the Republic is the embodiment of stability. It embodies successful policy run by Lukashenko in his early days of rule. Right-hand side, you see the museum to the Second World War, which will be demolished quite quickly in 2014. Place of victory, square of victory. Definitely, a socialist city benefits a lot. This square plays a huge role in its life. The victory in the Second World War is an important ideological backbone. This is what it looked like in the occupation days. This is 1972, image dating back to 1972. The square of victory, Siegesplatz. So basically, this is when the restoration started. And that restoration should be called overhauling, complete overhauling of the building. Only isolated buildings remained, but essentially the early 70s saw this avenue transformed into something completely new. The Colossus place, Square of Colossus in Arthur Klino's classification. Jakob Kolas is the actual person that gave his name, the Belarusian writer, gave his name to the square. Chaotic structures in post-war 1970. This is when the monument to Jakob Kolas was erected. The place of love, the square of love, Kalinin Square. This is 1960s. The monument to Kalinin has not yet been erected, but well, it projects a lot of love. This is when the monument was installed and restored, but there was not much interest. There were several publications that did the math as to how much money was spent to restore this monument to Kalinin, but largely Mr. Kalinin is still there in the Square of Love. So what is typical for this ideal socialistic city? Well, first of all, it is a contrast to the idea of a capitalistic city. Everything, it is supposed to contrast everything that came before, this alien ideology of capitalism embodied by previous versions of the city. It is erased, it is downplayed, it is put on the back burner or erased, demolished completely. Also, as I have said, this reconstruction, this restoration of Minsk is largely the creation of a new socialist city from scratch. For the architects that were dealing with this, this was the objective at hand. This was the challenge. This was the opportunity to create something that was not there before. The idea of a socialist city in Minsk has been implemented to the most complete extent compared to any other Soviet city. What is typical for this area as well? Moscow has a lot of influence as to the image of Minsk, not just ideologically, but also the expert evaluation, because the first urban plan, the general plan, Gen plan, was mostly devised by Moscow-based or Leningrad-based architects, or architects from other spots of the Soviet Union who did not were not aware of the context, who did not have any sentimental link to the place, who just perceived this as an opportunity to create something new rather than restore something that used to be back then. Now, what is this model of the socialist city I've mentioned that they don't really understand what it is supposed to mean from the viewpoint of designing and urban planning tools. Well, obviously, Stalin's care, or the idea of Stalin's care about the human being is expressed. The intention to improve the housing conditions of the people. This was the idea, because people were living in shacks, in some detached buildings of very poor quality, some very mediocre living standards. So this was supposed to be taken care of. So socialistically, it's a modernist city. It follows the principles of modernism: greenery, air, light, and the principle of functional division: zones for work, for zones for residential areas, and leisure. Also, it's quite special for Belarus that the national style has never been there. Russian classicism was borrowed to replace it, or to serve as such. The Russian classicism was competing with constructivism that was developing in Minsk in the 1930s, but ultimately the Russian classicism took over and prevailed. For this reason, the avenue is built up in the Russian classicism manner. So this is when we see, around this time, we see that the downtown is elongated to the northeast. A major break in the construction, a major shift, a paradigm shift in construction. Not much changed. This is the way Minsk started to look like. In the 1960s, 70s, this will be the shortest chapter in my presentation, because the only thing that is prominent for Minsk around this time is the incredible pace of urbanization, mostly because of my migration of rural populations. The rest is quite similar to everything that was going on pretty much anywhere in the Soviet Union. The eradication of extra stuff, or the stuff that was not supposed to be there, the redundancies, the urban planning finally is given to Belarusians. So Belarusians finally have a say in what is going to be happening here. The concept of compact city is replaced by the concept of the functional city. I've mentioned that Minsk is modernistic in its morphology, but the construction areas that are adjacent to the avenue are quite dense. These are the kind of pictures that we see around this era: quite sparse residential areas, functional rather than compact. The attention is given to the micro boroughs, micro regions, micro districts, not the downtown, but the outskirts. They're supposed to feature proper infrastructure and service local centers of life. The next era was dubbed the period of urbanistic nostalgia by Thomas Bon. So what is happening here? Again, the recollection of the topic of the Second World War comes back. This is the Stela. Steli means the hero city, 1985. So the toponymics, the unveiling of the Steli Minsk hero city, 1985, which is when Minsk was granted this title. And well, this renaissance of this topic is seen. Also, there are isolated referrals to the historic heritage. This is also 1985. This project is dubbed the Troitskaya suburb, the Troitskaya Predmestye in Russian. This is the reconstruction, but actually the historic bit are only the foundations. The rest is newly built buildings, art workshops, cafes, styled after the 19th century buildings. This is not authentic. So this place is not far from the historic core, from the authentic core, again, next to the Nemiga river. So this is the referral to the past of the city. This is looking back to the past of the city. At the same time, the authentic buildings, Nemiga streets, are demolished around that time. This was protested against by the population, but the urban authorities proceeded with the demolition. This is mid-90s centuries we're talking about. You see those slanted roofs, low, quite low buildings. I mean, 2 stories only. This is looks like a lot like Vilnius. people say, and quite modernistic things emerge around that time. This is a residential plus a commercial place in the ground floor. This is a very elongated space. The construction of this commercial place, the shopping mall на Nemiga, was going on for several years. Again, getting back to our parallels, the downtown, the historic core that used to host this castle, the fortress, it is cleared up. This is where Minsk was starting, but this place is cleared up. New buildings are constructed. The new downtown is preserved where it used to be. So basically, the new downtown exists around the same place where the old downtown used to be. So this era is again the rise of anti-fascist and pacifistic moods. Again, Minsk is no longer a Soviet city; it is a hero city. Everybody is tired. The population, the architects are tired of typical copy-paste designs that have flooded the city. More individualistic projects are implemented. And there is a pinpointed referral to the historic heritage. On the one hand, like I said, some parts of the architectural heritage is demolished, but others are restored. The idea to demolish Nemiga does not date back to late 80s. It is even pre-war, because Nemiga used to be associated with something with bourgeoisie, with capitalist the trends, which was not welcome in the socialist city. Another era, the street ballet and socialist decorations. So this is a bit special. This is a bit blown out of proportion. 1989, the contemporary Square of Independence. There is a lit up Christmas tree, the statue of Lenin, but no one around, not a single soul. So quite a lot of regulations, quite a lot of pressure is put on the image of the urban space. Various practices, such as CCTV, video surveillance, and police patrols are used to keep this in line. This is the reconstruction of the Independence Square. In 2004, exemplified by the Kiev Maidan, they started building an underground shopping mall. Architecturally, it's also is quite like the Kiev's underground Maidan. There are several glass domes. Well, it's quite problematic to hold any conventions or any protests there, because they're broken up physically by those glass domes that emerge from the foundation. Again, this myth about the victorious folk, about the victorious people, is nationalized. This is the attempt to create a new Belarusian identity. This is the new museum of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. It is built next to the Steli, Minsk Hero City. This facade imitates the festive fireworks. So it's not the pain, it's not the tragedy and loss that is commemorated, but the topic of triumph and victory. This is the leading theme. Also, the toponymics, the names of the streets are very important. Minsk has preserved very many old toponyms, unlike other cities of the ex-Soviet Union. This is a piece of research from Andrei Kazakevich. The largest proportion, 15.5% of streets, are called after the war, or something related to war. Another prominent fact, 9% Russian culture and history. 9% of toponyms are linked to Russian history and culture. 8.2 is the Belarusian culture and history, pre-Soviet and Soviet period. Everything that's related to the war, these are prominent public spaces. Downtown-ish, which is also quite indicative. So they have preserved these names referring to or linking them to the wartime. So what is typical here? Minsk finds itself in a situation where it's no longer Soviet. It's a non-Soviet capital city. Minsk has to come up Minsk has to invent its own identity and help the nation together with it, and legitimize the political regime that was installed in the country since late 90s, mid 90s. Like I said, several practices of control, like CCTV and police patrol, are implemented. The public spaces are quite strongly regulated. This is protested by portion of city dwellers, but these are limited. These are very limited. Many people take it for granted and they're quite conformist in their attitude, so they do not protest. The adequate consequence is the very weak public life, cultural life in the public spaces. Public representation is very bleak. New cultural constructs are created. This ideological recycling is happening, as one of the researchers dubbed it, Ms. Becker's 2017, the nationalization, popularization of this myth. New myths emerge, that Minsk is a clean and well-ordered, well-organized city. This is a myth that is top-down, and that is talked about from the top and brought down to the public. The Belarusians are told how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to behave in this new reality of modern. On the other hand, the urban dwellers themselves start taking this as part of their identity. So that's it for my part. If you appreciate this, these are the main sources that I've used. This is the list of references, some of them quite interesting. If you wish to get back to me and get in touch with me later on and discuss some of them, I'll be pleased to. These are my contact details. Yes, thank you very much indeed, Marina. It's a quite interesting story of Minsk. I suggest that every member of the audience, everyone who's following us here, please reserve your questions to Marina until later. Now we'll give the floor to Dmitry Boyko. The floor is yours. Volgograd, former Stalingrad, former Tsaritsyn. Unlike Minsk, the city was renamed 3 times throughout its history. Now we're about to learn how its image, its appearance, changed throughout the years. Dmitry, are you here with us? Dmitry? So, okay, while we're waiting for Dmitry to take the floor, now would be the time to ask some questions to Marina. If you have any urgent questions while Dmitry is joining us. May I have a question? Of course. How much did it cost to restore Minsk post after the war? How much money was allocated to the capital city in detriment to other cities? You know, it's an interesting question. I will not be able to give you a figure. I'm not aware of it. But indeed, there was a very significant skew, very significant shift. Many people were brought from other cities, from villages, from smaller towns to restore Minsk. So there was an obvious bias, an obvious skew, but I will not be able to give you specific figures. I believe that Thomas Bohn's book entitled Minsk Phenomenon, the Phenomenon of Minsk, would be the good source for you. Thank you for the question, Daniil. Thank you, Marina. Dmitry is now with us. I'll just go back to my first slide. Let's start over. Right, 1925, Tsaritsyn was renamed to Stalingrad, and in 61 it had to be renamed back to Volgograd. So the shortest time span in the city's history was when it bore the name Stalingrad. However, it is because of this short, it is still due to this short era in the city's history that people know it as Stalingrad. So back in the era when the city was still referred to as Tsaritsyn, there was a spike in the population count, and the curve went exponential because of industrialization before the war. It happened before the Second World War. And after the war, obviously, the population was also spiking, soaring quite quickly. you see that these arrows are signified by different colors. They also signify the change in the population. First of all, Tsaritsyn was quite chaotic. It was organized around the standard rectagonal framework. This railway line, I wish you to pay attention to it. It dissects the city into two parts. There is a small curve here in the middle. So you see a small bend in the middle. This is the railway. It's located here in the middle. It's 1924. The Tsaritsa River crosses it. According to one of the versions, the city was named Tsaritsyn after this river. So there are 4 conceptual bits of urban construction, of urban planning, that took shape in the early years of industrialization in the city. It is depicted by several urban micro-districts that used to exist, neighborhoods that had their own toponyms, Balkany, Dargara, and so on. So these names of the boroughs of these neighborhoods are not listed, but they took shape during the pre-war years. In 1930, the general plan, the master plan of Stalingrad was created, led by Mr. Semyonov, the architect. What can we say about the architect Semyonov? He was the person who lived before the revolution. He lived for 5 years in the UK. He came back to Russia in 1912. It was still Russia, not the Soviet Union. He published a book on urban planning
как главный вопрос городского планирования.
In the modern understanding of the word. So what do we do with urbanization? 1912, urban planning. So this expert, this architect, was observing the city's growth along the bank of the river Volga. The main objective was, since it's happening this way, since the city becomes elongated because of these factories, surrounded by factory settlements, he decided to create the green public centers, which was contemporary for that time, with access to water. So this is the avenue leading to the water, and he envisaged the same kind of avenues of approach to the river for other places. So this also affected what was happened after the war. August 23rd, 1942 was one of the most fierce bombings of the city. It started on the 23rd of August. It lasted several days, although the bombers used to be there, used to come earlier. So August the 23rd is one of the darkest pages of the city's history. The city was demolished. The oil tank cars that were there on the railways, they were pierced. They exploded, or they started leaking. This oil got into water. The water started burning. A lot of the population was evacuated, but quite a bit of people stayed on. Thanks to the German archive aerial photos, we can compare this place. So this is not all of the place, Tsaritsyn, Stalingrad, Volgograd. This is just the downtown. This is just the, pay attention to this curve of the bend of the railway and the tributary of Tsaritsa as it accesses Volga, as it enters Volga, flows into Volga. So these are the bulk of the buildings was destroyed around that time, 1942, 1943. But opinions vary on this as to how big a portion of the city was demolished and how well could you restore, could the restorers bring back what used to be. Right-hand side from Tsaritsa and below on this image near the railway, we see the square around which the streets are bending. They form an arch. There's no rectangularity, pure rectangularity here anymore. everything that's happening north of the railway, north and to the west, we see that the private detached houses dominate. Only a small portion of the city is built up with capital, with big major buildings. As of 1941, out of 90,000 residential houses, only 2,000 were stone ones, were built of stone. So this allows us to say that it didn't take much to demolish the city completely. The wooden structures just went. So those houses were not contemporary even according to the then standards. This is the intersection of the Pражskaya Street and the Avenue of Lenin, the contemporary ones, with significant destructions. This is the central department store where Field Marshal Paulus was taken captive. This is the image of the same from a different angle. So looking at these images, we can gain some, or we can start doubting whether the city was totally demolished, like 90% of, because there is a lot of documents, there are aerial photography images that show that not everything was destroyed by far. I mean, there were huge buildings in the center of the city that were lacking the roofs because they were wooden, but they were in quite good shape. The walls were in quite good shape, definitely preserved foundations. So for this reason, the history that the city was demolished to 90%, well, there's no historical corroboration to that. There's nothing to support it. According to several sources, the fully demolished, I mean, like razed to the ground, only 20% of the buildings suffered that fate. The bulk of the city, of the city's buildings, around 80 buildings, 80% of buildings, they were affected, but not demolished, not razed to the ground. So this means that the buildings, particularly in the downtown, they were reparable. They could have been repaired. And after the battle for Stalingrad was over, 1943, in 1 year from then, by 1944, about 20% of the pre-war housing stock was restored by the city dwellers. At the same time, this is the Pavlov's house wall. There is this pun here. So when we will defend you, our mother Stalingrad, the mother city of Stalingrad, there is one letter that is added there. It's a Russian air. Отстроим, we will rebuild it. So we've defended it, now we'll rebuild it. Now, the perspective that Stalingrad should be rebuilt from scratch, it was nurtured by both the architectural community and the political management. The president of the Academy of Wartime Architecture, Mr. Vesnin, formulated the main objective as follows. It's not just the restoration of the something that had been restored, mechanically copying all the shortcomings, but to create a new city, new ensembles. So instead of mechanically copying the flaws that existed in the previous planning and development, the city's ensembles and individual buildings were supposed to be created to be even more beautiful and majestic than they were before the destruction. Nominally, the #1 person, Mr. Kalinin, #1 in the country, he sent a letter to the city's architects in the Pravda article. So Stalingrad is mentioned twice in that brief letter. So Mr. Kalinin's article mentions several key factors that would not have been known to him as a political figure without his architectural advisors. He pays attention to the direction of winds, abundance of sunlight, and Volga, and the sands brought by the western wind. Certain urban planning was supposed to be envisaged to counter that.
Надо сообщить вам некоторую периодизацию.
Here's something I need to present to your attention as well. Several waves of planning and construction. So I will try to stick in that time frames. This periodization is based on properly the key event that happened in the urban planning life of Stalingrad as a place for experiments. So the all Soviet Union experiment. This is the open contest for a draft project, draft design of the central square with a monument to the heroic defenders of the city. Until then, there was no such thing as an open contest. Professionals were working on that. Regardless of the fact that there was this pathos of the patriotic reconstruction around, there was also an objective to rebuild the city as quickly as possible. The objectives resolved were more functional. So the general planning objectives were resolved. The designing was running almost in parallel with actual construction works because this was dealt with by different ministries, the different institutions. Well, in some points, the economically strong entities restored the housing for their employees without waiting for the higher-ups to tell them so. So since the people that lived in Stalingrad before the war, in the earlier days, they did not know what it was to live in their own apartment blocks. So there was largely detached buildings, private houses. So people rebuilt their homes in the spaces where they used to be before the war. The working teams were building that. However, several academicians at the Academy of Architecture were thinking about the downtown part of Stalingrad, the one I've shown in the aerial photography. They designed several designs, several draft designs that were largely transformed at the time of implementation. In 1944, Mr. Sembirtsev was appointed as head architect of the city. He contributed to a lot of changes, and an even larger scale of monumentality of the central part of the city was ensured. Getting back to architect Alabyan, who came to Stalingrad in 1943 after the end of the battle for Stalingrad. He came back there to design the master plan. He pointed out seven flaws of urban planning. Highlighted in green are the shortcomings, are the flaws that were more or less eliminated by following proposals of his colleagues. The flaws that are still in black in my slide have not been resolved to date. These are flaws of planning, flaws of design. There was a very big willingness to remedy them, but there was a failure to do so. One of the most important here, one of the most important downsides and drawbacks of the city is the lack of comprehensive architectural ensembles. Building those was the main objective put forth before the architects coming to Stalingrad ever since the war. The second wave of the planning and design works, 1945-1957, which is Mr. Sembirtsev's time. In 1951, we see a lot of quite specific proposals, looking at fixing local problems, local flaws. One of the biggest challenges was to limit the length of the city. The Kirovsky and Krasnoarmeysk districts were supposed to be isolated into a standalone city. This would have gotten the urban planners the compact model that used to what was mentioned by Marina for Minsk around the same period. Everything that pertained to residentials, well, the private houses had to go, apartment blocks were to be constructed, no more detached houses, no more ever-expanding periphery. The periphery was supposed to be taken care of by the new industrial projects. The railway tracks, they tried to avoid allocating too much land, too many land plots to those, and everything that was referring to architecture, water supply, electricity, this was supposed to be going to the west, to ensure the compact structure. That was the goal. Mr. Sembirtsov said that a city should be built rather than a collection of factory settlements, as it used to be the case for the 1930s master plan. However, until 1950s, the issue remained. The population was still suffering from poor housing conditions. The issues that were raised and taken care of by the Khrushchevka's construction, this mass panel building, Stalingrad was the first one to be granted resources for the post-war restoration. The residential places was the key part in the 1960s, was no longer part of the agenda. A huge number of people, starting from 1943 and all the way until late 50s, they lived in the housing conditions that were below standard. Doctor in architecture, Ms. Krysenkova, she highlighted several main points, A and B, two tendencies of post-war restoration. So A and B, I just took the liberty of deciphering these letters into A, ensemble in Russian, the first letter is A. Strive to architectural integrity and universal over-planning of the entire urban space. The city was supposed to be construed as a single ensemble. And the B point, the baraki shacks, the destructive shaping of the urban fabric as just a collection of factory-based settlements, it was bad. So it's temporary. The documents issued in Moscow highlighted the fact that it was temporary, it was short-term use with below standard welfare conditions, shacks, basements was definitely not the #1 issue. So basically ensembles and shacks. Again, the architectural creative work, the main points that were the most important ones is the creation of the perfect radiant city. Radiant are the words by Le Corbusier, again the topic of modernism, but again in his utopic understanding of the word. There is another reference, another bridge to Minsk, the perfect utopic city, cities that can never be. And the second topic, the second theme was the theme of memory, remembrance. The Pantheon, obelisks, panoramas, museum complexes, monuments that are quite big, and I mean as big as park and palace ensembles, with a lot of sculpture, at least as the draft designs went. Two intersected streets, which is still there in Stalingrad, still seen there. All these topics were highlighted later on, not just in the post-war restoration era. In a nutshell, two options were put on the table. One option was to restore the city as it used to be, and the second one were the missions, which missions should be pursued by urban planners in the post-war era. Both times, the option was for more monumentality, more creativity, architectural creativity, more beautiful buildings, but not the resolution of the economic issues. Architect Shushev, as it used to be believed, he also came to Stalingrad with other architects of the Academy of Architecture, and he voiced the opinion that the city should be restored as it was. At the same time, Alabyan and Simbirtsev, these two architects, they were advocating the betterment of the city. The previous issues were supposed to be fixed. And again, according to the priorities, instead of the restoration of residential houses for people who are coming back from evacuation, coming back to repopulate the city that they had to abandon, the city got proper residential areas only in the central part, in the downtown. Properly constructed architectural ensembles that are still there, that are very interesting for the theoreticians of architecture, but back then, and especially now, they are a particular point of pride for each Volgograd dweller. At the same time, the city, monument city, by Alabyan, it is not the city that people would wish to live in. Particularly, I wanted to show some examples, some private examples, just to corroborate, to demonstrate this point. Now, particularly, this is the city view as seen from the Volga River. The first images, the master plan in 1930, led by Vladimir Semyonov, was masterminded by Vladimir Semyonov. There was like a gateway, something that we've seen in Minsk, and now we see we see this propylae as a gateway from the water rather than the railway track, and we proceed along this monumental architectural ensemble. Now, as for the movement from the water to the downtown, this is the contest of 1944 I mentioned. I just wish to mention some of the most important topics that have found reflection later on. This is the construction of the memorial, the Stalingrad epic story. Stalingrad epic. It's a lot like Zikkurat. It's very difficult to find an image that would be more referring to memory, to remembrance as a pyramid. We see that this road to the temple, to the Zikkurat, is there's some sacred gates at the entrance. It is sacred in meaning, sacred in function. This concept affected subsequent solutions, particularly it led to the creation of this monument, where we see some pyramid shape, terrain, artificial hill, although there was a small hill there initially. They decided to put more ground there, with an additional, quite a lot of additional land ground was brought there. This pyramid-shaped mountain was built, the mound, and there is the monument. The motherland is calling. Same idea, a road to the temple. It's quite a laborious journey. It's quite a laborious trip to get there. The railway track, bridges. So several points of impression are created to instill this mood, mood of sanctuary. Also, there was a story. I wanted to highlight the monumental importance of Stalingrad. Winston Churchill asked Stalin in 1943 in Tehran. He said, "What if we leave Stalingrad in ruins?" Definitely, Stalin was opposing to that. He said that we should restore it. I believe that that myth was propping up that same idea of monumental propaganda. We're using the palace and temples, these ensembles, complexes was highlighted, that was implemented in Stalingrad. And we've been unable to say, we have not been able to locate the evidence that Churchill actually suggested that Stalingrad should be left in ruins. The second topic I wish to touch upon here is the palace of the Soviets. It was also continued in contemporary Stalingrad in an unexpected presentation. You see the city of Volga perpendicularly above. There is this Alley of Heroes. This street is called the Alley of Heroes. The temple itself, the palace of the Soviets, is located right there. After the revolution, it was dubbed as the square of the fallen fighters. Fallen revolutionary fighters was the original meaning, but the buildings in black are not here. Well, it's just the design. It's just the master plan. But the heroic symbols, the obelisk that existed back then, they were carefully continued in mid-40s, early 50s. And this axis, the Alley of Heroes, is getting us to Volga through that gateway to water that I've shown before, so the proper Lee. The perpendicular street crossing here in the middle, it's entitled the Avenue of Lenin, and it matches the classic drawing of the Kumanos plan. The palace of the Soviets was considered at many architectural meetings, but it was never built. Starting from 1944, it was depicted in various formats, various architectural forms. It was depicted here, but that place has been vacant since. Particularly, this is one of the most well-known designs, supported by architects in Birza back then. It was the architect Rudnev's design. It repeats the symbolic architectural forms of the Moscow Stalin high-rise buildings. So the same design is portrayed here later on, I mean the same site. The prospective plan of the downtown Stalingrad. And here you see the willingness to refer the construction of this place to the Roman and Greek sacred complexes like the Acropolis. There was the strive to create this association. Now this is the 1970s design, which is in line with later architectural styles. The obelisk in the front is the obelisk that commemorated the victims of the civil war in Russia. No trees here, which is very bad for Stalingrad with 40+ centigrade in summer. So there was a continuation. There was another axis stretching beyond the palace of the Soviets quite a long way. And then perpendicular to it, there was another broad avenue that led to the Motherland is Calling, that monumental statue I've shown before. So this is what we have in Stalingrad these days on that place. This is the cathedral to Alexander Nevsky. It is erected in the square of the fallen fighters of the revolution. Around some buildings which are reminiscent to Roman portals. You see that theater there, which is kind of like antiquity. The red and white building is the fire brigade building. So it's the fire watchtower. So it looks a bit like Tsaritsyn, the older city. That place is used as a parking lot. The image, the symbolic integrity that used to be vacant is now taken. A shorter case I wish to bring to your attention is the city's street of peace. This is 1950s. Left-hand side, the building by Mr. Goncharov's design. Peace to the world is a slogan running in the middle of the street. So the street of peace, each house, each entrance, each apartment, the hearts will always remember them. This was the first street that we restored the Stalingrad from, the city of Stalingrad from. So, this is the street running to the right from the alley, from the palace of the Soviets. So you take a right to on the alley of heroes, and you will see this street of peace. This is what it looks like, Ulica Mira these days. The planetarium, which is shaped like Pantheon. We see the movement to the temple, towards the temple. This time, architect Simbirtsov, and this is how it looks on the roofs. Vera Mukhina's sculpture is put on above. She's also well known for her monument to the workman and the peasant woman. So not many people know. However, most dwellers of Volgograd who are interested in history, they're clinging to the 200 sites pre-revolution time. And those sites are easily locatable in the preserved part of the city. Right here, we see the central railway station of Volgograd. There is the railway track alongside. The merchant Dontsov's house is in the foreground, which is completely Tsaritsyn era. It is still used, actively used. It is still active. All these sites, all these places are in that or another extent related to Tsaritsyn, and they're busting this myth. They're there in the old streets that are technically not there. They are preserving what used to be in the city before the war. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dmitry, for the interesting talk about the city of Tsaritsyn, Volgograd, Stalingrad, Tsaritsyn, Stalingrad, Volgograd, in that sequence. We have the time for the questions, comments. And now, using this occasion, before the listeners are contemplating their comments and questions, I will now take this time to ask right away, getting back to Marina's words. I wish to ask Dmitry and Marina a question. So there was an interesting phrase dropped that the architects that used to build Minsk, or not restore Minsk, but mostly building it anew from scratch, they were not sentimentally linked to that place. And I keep having this a bit of a broader question on this one, on this point. Maybe it's also a harmful question. Has any architect ever had a sentimental link to the cities they were restoring? Because you mentioned this design of late 19th century, the idea of to build a city, a new city on the old place. It is typical for the 19th and 20th centuries. Reconstruction of the city, making them greener, more comfortable for the city dwellers, and so on and so forth, everything you've been talking about. So I keep having this question based on that. So this sentimental link, this sentimental bond with the place, does it ever arise? Maybe it's a thing of late 20th, early 21st century. Or it is supposed to be linked to the fact that the architects should come from the locals. Does it happen? That doesn't happen at all. Thank you. It is a question to both Marina and Dmitry, linking specifically to Minsk and Volgograd. Thank you. This is a very sophisticated, very complicated question that I've been contemplating quite recently. Now, I believe that this is strongly related to the era when the architect is active. In case of the post-war restoration, it also coincided, that restoration coincided with the modernist trends and the lack of sentimental sentimental bond to any other, to any piece of the old times. This was the global tendency. For this reason, these sentiments were put to the background. When this bond is created, I'm not sure when it takes place. If it's universal, it's a contract that started to be relevant at some point. It was created artificially. It's tough for me to say. But in the case of Minsk, I can give you an example of Moscow. And again, Artur Klinov is writing that in his book. Moscow did preserve quite a lot of urban fabric. And he explains that by the fact that it was restored by local architects, by the Moscow-based architects. They were really trembling. The hand was trembling. The heart was shaking. They were not able to demolish everything that completed Moscow back then. So it's not ideologically whole. It is surrounded by Arbats, Zaryadiyas, Sretenkas, all this old chaotic Moscow. It surrounds the current downtown. Sporadic and low, not tall buildings. This has not happened in Minsk. Yes, you've answered my question, Dmitry. Yeah, it's a broad question. It's a cunning question. It's a broad one at that as well. It's very difficult to categorize all the architects in the same category and to send them there on the same train. We should not just split them into eras, into periods. The era that we're referring to was quite fierce debates on the architectural scene, architectural stage of the Soviet Union. The Academy of Architecture was there as a center for competencies, the Union of Architects, and the State Committee for Architecture and Urban Planning. It was actually the ministry that was supervising this creative work. At some points, the architects were supposed to stay alive, to fight for their survival. And in some cases, they had to use the conditions to find places for commissioning orders, to get their orders filled, or basically to offer works on commission. So not all the architects were decent back then. I don't claim their personal qualities, but to land commissions, to be awarded orders, well, people had to do things we would refrain from doing these days. Secondly, the architects that still remembered the beautiful, they were creative professionals. Particularly, Mr. Gladychev referred to this professional in his career as servile. So this servile mission to implement the chief's ideas. Obviously, the chief that was there at the head of the state in the post-war reconstruction time, he was clearly dictating the demands for the architecture to the architects. And the architects whose ideas were not matching those plans and ideas and concepts by the chief, they were not really popular. They were not given good commissions, good orders. Mr. Symvirtsev, the architect of the city in the post-war time, he was so sentimental. He actually delved deep down into the soul of the city that was given to him as a place for creativity. He got creative in the city, but it wasn't just his reflection of the beautiful. It wasn't just his interpretation of the beautiful. He took in quite a lot of the Volgograd himself. But I believe that the architects are indeed kind of serfs. However, if you did land a contract, you'll be able to navigate larger or smaller extent to get what you want, not what the customer dictated. Yes, just a small comment I would like to provide here. I will definitely agree that there is context, there is a time, there are opportunities for the architects to do that, particularly in severely ideologized and repressive contexts, to still shine through. I will also say that a great architect always strives to first understand the peculiar features of the city, its main interesting points, and then try to build something in that city. I will also say that even without this interesting parts, even without these mojos, an architect who is able to build someone to the distaste of the citizens, that architect becomes the part of the city's topos, the city's mythology, and maybe this place will be favored by the urban dwellers later on. These things have happened in the past. I'll not take too much time. Maybe there are people wishing to ask the question. Yeah, there's a question in the chat box, Sergey. Check out the chat box.
Сергей, у вас звука нет.
Sergey, your sound is muted. No, you have a question? No, I'm saying that there is a question from Mikhail Polyakov in the chat box. Okay, let me check this out. Yeah, there is a question. I can read it out because it is referring to me, to Minsk. So basically, is it possible now to describe those areas of urban design and planning that will develop in Minsk in the near future? Does the government have their own view of the city's arrangements, and how does this view determine the urban development of Minsk? Well, it does determine it to quite a big extent. The authorities do determine this. Secondly, I'm not sure whether this view that they take can be referred to as expert, comprehensive, and strategic. The level of expertise is low. This is the issue. And the second problem is that the authorities rarely turn to actual experts to take that or another decision. How urban design and planning will develop, it's tough to tell at this point, because quite a lot of decisions made in Minsk are out of touch with global tendencies. Quite recently, there was a statement by the mayor that because of the well-being level, every Minsker has a personal car, several public transport routes should be cut back on. This is contrary to the global development of urban spaces, pedestrian areas, sustainable, environmentally friendly public transport, but Minsk is taking a turn to a very different direction. So right now, the tendency is this is the current policy, but if the common sense, if the reason prevails, I believe that these tendencies will be shared by, will be the same as in other European cities. Environmental friendliness, social sustainability, a lot of attention to the environmental agenda, the development of public spaces, the development of alternative transportation means. So quite a lot of predictable tendencies seen in the world these days. I hope I've answered this question. Thank you. Lado, can you hear me? Yeah, we can hear you. I can ask my question now, right? Okay, thank you for the invitation. I'm talking to you from Tbilisi. There are certain parallels in the challenges that we're facing, and there are some other considerations. First of all, thank you to all the speakers for their talks. You've brought me back to my years of youth, the Soviet Union. I used to know Minsk back in the day, not so much Volgograd. I was not there, haven't visited it physically. However, we've heard a lot about the typology of the city. Two questions, if I may. The first question to Dmitry. The first question to Marina. It's about Minsk. Could you please tell me, is anything conserved in the urban planning? Are there some protected areas, or this conservation approach has been dropped? I have not been able to pick that up from your talk. Secondly, you've given a very interesting story about the compositional nature. However, the functional zoning, virtually nothing has been mentioned. Could you talk about that? Industrial areas of Minsk, for example, industrial areas, how they affected the development. Was there a split or so I'm asking this about Minsk. And two questions to Dmitry. Back in the day, the literature described Volgograd, Stalingrad of 1930s. As far as I remember, German architects were involved at some place. And it was supposed to feature an interesting, very rare typological example of a linear city development. Linear city, there's not too many of those. There's too few of those in the world. It was the dream of urban planners. I saw your mother and so on. This is well-known things. So could you please tell me, have you dropped this idea in Volgograd? Because you've been talking about in-depth development and so on and so forth. I remember the city's length was supposed to be 7 kilometers, or it is 70 kilometers now, 70 kilometers long. It's a linear city. So that's my first question about Volgograd I'm interested in. Second part, the involvement of Volga. The Volga, how is it involved in the urban fabric? We've seen the Propylae, but embankments, beaches, maybe some of that is also available in Volgograd. I'll be delighted to hear about that. Thank you in advance for your answers to my 4 questions. Thank you. As for the conservation and protection of heritage, of course, the formal mechanisms are envisaged. Some buildings enjoy the status of historic architectural legacy, values, valuable buildings. There are some regulations about protected areas, as in naturally protected areas from development. But in our context, the personal decision by the president can annul all that. This has happened before. This keeps happening now. There is a group of activists that are trying to tackle that. There are professional communities who try to tackle this. However, these conflicts spark up quite often, even exemplified by the main avenue that I've mentioned a bunch of times. It is also quite well known. In the early 2000s, it was fighting for the status of the ensemble that was supposed to be featured on the UNESCO's protected heritage sites. It was a vertical process, top down. The city, the authorities, the government was very interested in that. But then the government started pursuing more capitalistic moods for this project. So new buildings came up that were transferred to private contractors. A business center was erected in the Oktyabrsk city. There is a hotel, not yet commissioned, built but not commissioned, around the Victory Square. Unfortunately, these mechanisms of protection are not working, although formally they're there. Your second question, indeed, the functional zoning was one of the priorities. The working settlements were taking shape back then. In that mythology that Arthur Klino is preaching, there are the working suburbs. From the railway station, there are tram tracks, light rail, to the tractor plant that was also taking shape around that time. It's another city in the city with its own palace, with its own square that is duplicating in a way the railway station square, and so residential places, social architecture. I'm not really sure, I cannot really say that it's caused significant spatial and structural changes in Minsk. Minsk's population is fairly homogeneous, although occasionally in some places there were certain predominance of proletariat, of working people. Now it's very interesting to track the protest movement of summer, autumn last year, how they used to spike and progress in the neighborhoods of Minsk. There's no significant skew in that, but the practice shows that in the so-called workers' districts, workers' neighborhoods, the protest movement was not too strong. However, the new residential buildings with younger people, with technical intelligentsia, well, they have been much more active in that sense. Dmitry? Yes. Now, as for the linear city concept, so the colleagues they believe that Leningrad is linearly divided. A spatial structural delineation of cities. So it is ruined because there are many ravines in Volgograd next to the Volga River. And basically, it precludes from building a city in a straight line. These ravines are not allowing that. Secondly, I don't think that we have too much German heritage in urban planning in Volgograd, then Staliningrad, because the Ernst May's workshop that was operating in the 30s, there were 800 people working there in 1930. They were designing Magnitogorsk and a whole bunch of other cities in the Soviet Union, but not for Stalingrad. Their designs were not made for Stalingrad because the industrial areas and the residential buildings, residential settlements surrounding them were more or less ready. The Stalingrad factory, tractor factory, that was supposed to issue 1,500 tractors by 1929 was definitely not linked to German architects. There was a story that Albert Kahn, the American company, architect company, Albert Kahn, was designing the Stalingrad tractor plant. This is just a myth. Linear concept, I don't really believe that contemporary cities can develop in the strict compliance with a certain concept. My second slide showed that for 30 years, the population count was around 1 million, with a small downward trend tendency. So this is not an urgent question. To which direction do we build the new thousands of residential homes? Because the new residents are not there to take them, to occupy them. Being an advocate of more modern approaches to urban planning, it's my personal conviction. The compact city of Simbirtsev is closer to me. So no elongation along the Volga, grouping of the residential neighborhoods with nothing in between, with just reed growing between them. I would compact the city and create this cylindric structure. So I've been quite straightforward in that when talking about the concept of urban planning. Quite a lot has been written in the literature, but we don't see the movement to the linear city. As for your second question, I'll answer it, and maybe then you'll elaborate. The involvement of the Volga River in the urban fabric, in the urban setting. So the 1930s drawings by Vesnin with public center in every neighborhood facing Volga, they were not implemented. This only happened for the central neighborhood, was the Stalinsky neighborhood back then. It was called. In other cities, neighborhoods, the access to Volga is not implemented. It's a civilized. More questions? Yeah, there seems to be a comment from Ruslan Baramidze in the chat box. So possibly everyone has been able to read it. It's just a remark that originally we were talking about the destroyed cities and the ways to restore them. The notion of destroyed is a quite broad one. We took the post-war cities, the cities destroyed by the hostilities. So it's not just the civil war, it's not just the ex-Soviet. Well, in Georgia, there are also earthquakes that create troubles. So how do we work with something that was really destroyed, say, by an earthquake? It's not a question, it's more like a remark positioned by the author. But it's an important question about things perceived by us as rare. We live in the era of optimization, modernization, welfare booming in Russia, welfare development. The topic I really wish to cover, I've been discussing with the colleagues a long time ago. It is about the destroyed territories. It's a bit of a taboo topic. We have the Balkan nations, the Balkan countries' experiences, which are not really translatable to what's been happening in Ukraine. We have to keep our mouths shut about Abkhazia, about other territories. I'm really cautious, looking forward to the city of Grozny experience on March 17th. There will be the reconstruction of the Nagorno-Karabakh. So we really wish to believe that we live in the progressive today, but well, we need to remember, we need to work with something that has been destroyed. It's like Lego construction blocks that were buildings, and then there were none. They were destroyed. Show of hands if there are any questions. If there are no questions, well, the Aesopian language is, how do we come up with that? No, possibly Dima and Marina, you'll correct me because I might be wrong. I'm not an architect, but I've been working with architects, with people dealing with architectural stuff. I believe that this topic of destroyed cities, it's a bit tabooed. It's like mortality. We know that people die, but for example, I've been living in Germany for a long time. I haven't seen a single coffin in the street. I know that people die and their remains are taken somewhere, but we do not see that. The same thing is happening with the cities. What should be conserved? What should be restored as a memory? What should be preserved as a ruin to serve as a memory? I don't see that a lot in the public space. If it's wrong, could you please refer me to the places, to the platforms where this can be brought up? Dmitry, other forums, the reconstruction of Grozny, what can be found out about it? What's happening to Volgograd these days? So I visited the city of Vyborg recently. I was fascinated to know that Vyborg preserved its historical appearance. I don't remember the name of the head architect. After the war, he went through unthinkable trouble to get this status preserved. He basically managed to avoid his city, the city of Vyborg, to be restored. He got the budget to restore the city in the previous image. The other cities, Priazersk, they were not able to do that. So the cities which are located very close to each other have suffered a different fate, very different philosophies of construction, of restoration. Yeah, the situations differed for every particular city. I mean, St. Petersburg itself, it survived the Soviet reconstruction in many ways because Moscow was next to it, and the main effort was channeled to Moscow. That new city in St. Petersburg, it was just an annex to append and not to replace the previous one, not to replace the old one, which also contributed to the preservation of some places. For example, Belarusian cities, the city of Vitebsk. Vitebsk was properly destroyed. I mean, huge human losses. Minsk was severely destroyed. Vitebsk was severely destroyed. How it was done, it's a different question altogether. However, that image, that appearance of the ancient Vitebsk, it's quite new, although the hostilities ended a long time ago. Yeah, we're kind of engaging in lengthy discussions. I should say that we've exhausted the planned agenda. No, I just wanted to give you the floor for the summary comments. But I couldn't just do that. Well, I think it's a great thing that today's talks and reports have caused us to talk about things, to debate. Unless anyone wants to ask a question and provide a comment, I will risk to ask the final question, and then we'll get to concluding remarks. Now, my question is about this. Having listened to what you had to say, I have this image in my head. If Stalingrad, originally, I mean, after the war, or as the war was still raging, these concept designs, master plans, originally the point was to build a city to commemorate the war, to remember the war. Minsk started developing this other, the image of the city that suffered during the war, the hero city, the central memory of Belarusians about the war at a much later stage, after 1965, and possibly even later. But anyway, this is my first question. Am I correct to understand that? And the continuation, this way or another, both cities have, well, the memory of the war. It has become an important visual component. Talking about its history, telling the story about its history. When I come to Minsk or Volgograd, I keep stumbling upon these pieces of memory, artifacts of memory. So I have a more personal question, not to you as architects, specialists in architecture. So this memorial commemorative urban space, how integrated is it to the day-to-day goings of urban dwellers? You as school children, or later on when you were students, grown-ups, what do you know? What have you known about that? Were you kind of part of it? So I mean, these spaces, are they still relevant? Are they still in demand? Every urban dweller has spent some time by some monument or engaged in some ritual, participated in a rite or ritual, brought flowers, or it's just a part of heritage that is not interesting to the urban dwellers. They don't think about it a lot. And oftentimes the monuments become the rendezvous places, especially in Soviet places, in Soviet towns, Soviet cities, where there is a lack of symbols. So, okay, let's meet at the Pushkin monument, for example, because this is the only place easily identifiable. So we can't miss each other if we meet there. Yes, I believe. Thank you for the question. I believe you've correctly understood my message. Indeed, in Minsk, this main topic of the war is dating back to late 60s. When this whole mythology related to war starts to take shape in the Soviet Union. In Minsk, it's also quite manifested in the physical space. This started in late 60s. In 1974, Minsk was awarded the hero city. 1985, the Stela was built. So these monuments are being erected actively until recently. There was a renaming of the streets to commemorate the heroes of the war. However, the memorial in the Victory Square, that obelisk, It was created in 1956. It created back then in the first effort to restore the avenue, the main street. So the topic of the war was represented in that concept as well. It was not as central back then, true, but it was there. As for the day-to-day goings, well, in Minsk, the memory of the war is quite pronounced. It's pronounced, it's visible in the narratives that surround us, in the school textbooks, in news editions, in slogans that are still there on the buildings, like the подвигу народа жить в веках, the deed of the folk will live in centuries. So some part of the mundane that is penetrating the present, or this memory of the war penetrating the present. In some cases, it is lost. The fragmentization happens, as Andrei Kadakevich referred to it. And there is a different fate shared by monuments. I can't really say that all the places dedicated and commemorating the war are evolving, following the same pattern. It's different for various monuments. In the 1990s, the communists convened around this Victory Square. The meetings were convened there, the rallies, public meetings, public gatherings. Now the Victory Square is a regulated and protected place. Mainly government-led ceremonies are arranged there. The 9th of May, the Victory Day, commemorative dates, the liberation of Minsk. There are monuments that shared an entirely different fate, that in time gained a very different ideological load. For example, Marat Kazey's monument, the partisan hero, young guy, it's way in the Gorky Park. It's in the middle of the park. So young people gather there with a very different set of social practices. I mean, it's very the location of the monuments contributed to its further fate. Thank you, Dmitry. Anything you'd care to elaborate? Well, not a lengthy comment on my side, but globally, just one factor I wish to bring up. Recently, this sculpture, the Motherland is Calling, in Volgograd, there was a reconstruction. I mean, it's concrete foundations were being restored. This demanded wooden scaffolding around the monument, and this monument, which is 45+ meters high, it disappeared from the landscape. The scaffolding hid it. From some angles, it was a scary view because the citizens were unable to see that sculpture that they've been eyeballing for years. And since there is a lot of movement going on, it's Lenin Avenue, there is a new highway leading to the Volga Street, to the Volga River. It's quite intense. People moving in cars, they see it. Well, it's kind of like David Copperfield kind of disappearance trick. So that bit for me, it was unusual to me as a city dweller, because I see that something that used to be sacred just disappears as a smoke, and poof, it's gone. And this ideological sacral vacuum is created. What do we do without it, without that monument? Even hypothetically, this is a very scary question to ask. Exemplified by Volgograd, any person that would do branding for the city, they would find themselves in a tricky situation if they tried to give a wrapper around all that vast, large-scale monumental architecture that was going on for years, city monument. This monument city image is very difficult to eradicate. There's no such wrapper. There's nothing you can wrap it in. The people who live and feel themselves living in the cemetery, on some tombs, surrounded by tombs, it's not too comfortable. Although the patriotic upbringing as to the current ideological policy, it does have an imprint on that. But globally, the city dwellers have a different perception. Right, thank you very much. Getting back to this ideologimus, I keep getting this very weird feeling when the Avenue, Lenin Avenue is still intersecting with something. Well, the fact that the Lenin Avenue is still there somewhere. I wish to thank you once again. Lena, any elaborations on your part? No? Okay, in that case, I'll just add the words of gratitude of mine. Once again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you. See you. Have a good evening.